Before we get started with Paul's presentation, just want to do a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you've been in this room before, you've heard me say it. If you have trouble hearing in the back of the room, please let us know so we can adjust the sound. We want to make sure that you enjoy and benefit from all that Paul has to share. After this session, you'll have a 10-minute break to make your way back to the keynote room where we will do a fireside chat and a wrap-up of MarkLogic World. So with that, Paul, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me back there? Good. Yeah, thanks for coming today. I think there's a good chance that most of you have heard about the Data Hub framework and possibly attended a session or two talking to you about it, either at a high level or maybe you're looking to go to the workshop that's featured tomorrow, which goes in depth to the product. The framework is a layer of interaction with MarkLogic server that lets you quickly accelerate an application that you want to do that might offer search, might offer integration with geospatial capabilities, red action introduced in MarkLogic 9, or extending content for reports and discovery. So what we're going to go through today is we're going to talk a little bit about a message that you've probably heard a couple times, which is the solving of the data integration problem and how MarkLogic's approach focuses on that. And I'm going to go into an application that we built on top of MarkLogic's Data Hub framework and go into the weeds a little bit with the code, just enough so that you can kind of take away an appreciation of what we did with the enrichment that we did to the content to make it discoverable. As we go through it, I'll make time for questions also. So what do we heard Gary at the keynote talk about this. The idea is that there are two divisions inside of any corporate environment. There's the business, and then there's the IT organization. And often the business, who's the one who's trying to either create the content or retrieve the content, has a relationship with IT where IT stores the data in ways that are possible. And sometimes, quite often, unfortunately, the data is stored in a way where the content is not readily available in the way that the business expects it. And there can be processes in place that need to deliver that content the way that it's expected to be received. So the desired solution is the MarkLogic solution, which we're gonna focus on with the application. And the idea is that we want to make the data live in a place where people can intelligently work with it, where the business can understand what it is, and possibly even be in a position to ask questions that they didn't expect to. So what we need to do is we need to think about how can we make it so that when questions arrive that we don't anticipate, when data comes in shapes that we don't think that we can handle or we don't have time to work with schemas and mappings, how do we take that content in, work with it, and deliver it to people that are expecting it in whatever flavor they want it. So with that, I'm going to jump into a demonstration that I have, an application built with the Data Hub framework. The angle's such I'm sitting down, so here I am. Great. So before I do that, coming out of the slides, we heard a lot about MarkLogic 9 over the last couple days, and as I mentioned, the Data Hub workshop I think is at capacity tomorrow. But that's an important takeaway from today's conference is the idea of the new features that are coming with MarkLogic 9 that you can download today. Along with that, the Data Hub framework is available on GitHub, publicly accessible, for you to be able to download and follow the documentation to quickly stand up your own project and extend it for the experimentation or pathway to production that you have in mind. We're going to be using on the back end today a utility that we're not going to interface with, a command line utility called MarkLogic Content Pump. It's going to be the mechanism for getting some content in. I wanted to make sure that that was something that you were familiar with, at least by name. You can access MarkLogic's documentation. To get that, you can also go into MarkLogic's developer portal, developer.marklogic.com, to access the tools like the Data Hub framework, and even go in and get MarkLogic Content Pump and use it yourself. So for today's exercise, I wanted to focus on the MarkLogic value proposition and MarkLogic's approach to data integration. So the idea is that we're going to take data from a few different sources. I'm going to show you those sources. We're going to instantly be able to access that data. We're going to slightly modify the data for the sake of discovery. And then we're going to show the mechanisms that can be used with the Data Hub framework to make that content operational. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to point to some data sets that I have. Why don't we start out by me showing you where those data sets are. They're just here on my desktop. We're going to start out with some entities, which are customer sample data sets. And you can see here in the preview that we have tabular data. We have data that might have an email address and a street address in a highly normalized fashion, maybe an ID that allows us to recognize the record. And then in this other CSV file, this other table, we have a slightly different structure to the data. There are different elements. The elements that are the same maybe have a different name. Traditional data integration problem is when the data has different names or different shapes, how do we make it all roll up so that we can consider it all the same for a specific purpose? So in this application, which is made to follow those 4 phases of data integration that I showed you on the slide, we're going to load up the entities. Live demo, please hold. I think I might have been logged out. Yep, logged out. Great. Okay. I'm going to do that again. Great. So what I've done now is I've loaded each of those 2 tables, and I've broken down each of the rows from those tables into standalone documents in MarkLogic. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to peek into the data and take a look at what I've brought in. So in this application, I brought in, the CSS is off a little here. I think it's the projector. Whoa. There we go. Records, and when we take a look at one of them, like Amy Adams, for instance, we can see here that the data retains its original shape like what we saw in the table. We have first name, we have last name. We're also using a MarkLogic 9 feature called redaction, so that based on certain trends, we may have a name that's muted and the domain is still retained. We may have subsets of a social security number that are hashed out, or a phone number that's completely hashed out. Those are capabilities of the MarkLogic redaction feature. So if I go back and look at Adams, MarkLogic has an enterprise search engine built in, and everything's instantly indexed as soon as you bring it into the system. So if I look over at Julia Adams, for instance, if you remember the last record had first name, now we have F name, we have L name. This is a well-known problem for people doing integrated data. So what I can do to solve that is I can jump over to the next step in the phase. If you remember the wheel, the third one was harmonization. So what I can do is I can enrich the data by harmonizing it and making certain pieces of it pull from the differently structured data and move them to a new part of the record that looks the same. And I'll show you how we do that here. So I'm going to run this one routine to build the envelope pattern, which is a container for the original document that we had. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to put a header inside of the record. So let's take a look at what one of those records looks like. So when we look at the details and look at the XML, we'll see that we now have a header section put into the top of our document. And the header is going to say first name and last name. And it's also going to get some data about the context of what we ran. I was using my admin account, so that announced itself in here. The date that it happened is announced in here. So we can use those values to, for instance, say, show me all of the enrichment done by this person because we want to evaluate it because we realized 2 weeks later that they weren't executing code very well. But in this case, the takeaway is that we have first name up here on an element that has fname in its source content. And we're going to find that for records that started out as first name also. So I'll jump over to one of those. Let's just go back. Take a look at Amy Adams here. She had first name, last name in the first place. And with first name, last name as the starting point, we see that that's the same at the top. What that means is we can make data that has different shapes keep its provenance. The content section can keep what it was, but we can roll it up for the sake of seeing things across different entities and different sources and say these are the things that we care about. So this is a great time for me to break from this application and walk through a couple of the concepts. So when we look at the headers that are there at the top, I wanted to use a couple of other document sources to explain what it is that we just saw. So when we clicked on those buttons, those envelope pattern buttons and normalize buttons where we ran those routines, we were executing a snippet of code, like the code that you see here. And what that code is doing is it's taking session information and predefined information and saying, create the document to look like this based off what it was down in the content near the bottom of the highlight and build the headers on top of it. And we're updating the document with that structure. So let's take a look at an Excel file. MarkLogic can ingest content of all different shapes and sizes, while a CSV and an Excel file manifest the same way. Excel has a lot of eccentricities in its file structure. And you find that in the XLS story as well as the XLSX 2007 format. So what I'm going to do, did I already run it? Here we go. I'm going to run a bit of code that targets that file on my desktop and gives us an idea of what that shape is inside of the Microsoft proprietary format. We see that we have information about when the document was created, who created it, what version spit it out, different session information that allows for the application to load the document correctly. But then we also see the content, just this simple comma-separated, tokenized set of values inside of a p tag. So let's go a step further from that. And if you keep in mind, these are the kind of things that we do when we run the routines that we saw in the application. We clicked a button and we made the headers come in. We clicked another button and we populated the headers in the document structure with a consistent first name and a consistent last name. If I take some code here and paste this in here, what I'm saying is when you load that document, all I want to see is the author. That was inside of the document structure, but I needed to surface it. We can go past that with some other snippets of code I have here and say, let's start to look at the content itself, not just the author. So you remember those p tags that we saw inside of the document? These are those p tags. The first one we have is our header row. Everyone after that is a set of values that represent a record. We can go another level in and we're going to start to see something that makes a little bit more sense in XML and looks more like the record we saw in the application. By looping through all of them and taking a look at what that Excel file would look like if we captured it as an XML record. So we have a record, and we have a self-describing markup that captures the header in every one of the records as we would scroll through this list. This is Query Console, by the way, ships with MarkLogic. It's our development environment. And I'm running code just like the code that executed when I clicked that button. So I'm going to go one more level in so that we completely cover the idea of what we did in the application. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run another piece of code If you remember the code that I showed you that ran underneath that button, I'm reauthoring the document, taking the content on line 24 of what the source was. I can call it anything I want. Call it source, call it shoe, whatever you want. And then puts the header in with some of the values that I've decided to pull out of the source document. So now, just like we saw in the application, what we're doing is quickly, with 20, 25 lines of code, it could be a lot cleaner and shorter, we've manufactured a header at the top of a document that correctly represents the source record. So what that means is that we can have a clean and tidy version of the record for everything that we have time to think about, what we would normalize. But this record with MarkLogic search engine is going to be totally discoverable across all of that content, even the stuff we didn't have time to model. So if at some point I wanted to look up RSK as a major lob CD, right, and I type in RSK, I might not have modeled it at the top, but this document's still going to show up as a search result because the content's in there. I'm going to do the same thing with Google News here, but before I do, I want to stop and see if anybody has any questions. So let's take a look at Google News. I told them I didn't need an internet connection, but I have one, so that's good because I'm about to scrape the web. So in Query Console here, back to where we were, I've got another tab here. It's just called News. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to use a very simple web scraping function in MarkLogic called HTTP GET. And I'm going to point out to Google News. And I'm going to scrape the site and bring back two things. Well, it's one thing right now. It's going to be two things in the next step. Each result is the anchor tag for the clickable item of each headline. Okay, so we have the headline, title, text, and the links. We'll go a step past that. Run this code, and just like the envelope pattern, I've decided to target a couple of things that I care about. What's the link? What's the title? And then keep the provenance with the source document underneath it. I've got one more that I'm going to run, and then we'll go back to the application. And I'll stop again for questions before I do. So I'm going to take this code, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to recur. Let's see what line it is. Line 12. I'm going to say, you know that link that we brought back? Go out and go into the page that was that source article and bring some of that back too. We're going to go two layers in. And now when we do that, the record's long enough that unfortunately you can't see the next result starting, but you'll see here that we have the header, but we've created an article header element that shows you all the paragraphs from the actual article that was linked. So we not just brought back the Google News page, we went into every Washington Post article and we brought back just the paragraphs. We don't care about the markup or the styling. We just want the content. So those are the kind of things that you can do when you think about enriching your data. And in this case, this simple exercise, we just went ahead and created a header off of the data that was inherent to the document itself for the sake of making something consistent across sets. But we can ingest other things too. I'm going to point to this utility, and I'm going to ingest a PDF file. And when I do, the whole PDF file is going to be indexed. I'm going to go back here to access the data again. We'll see that there's one extra document that's created here. And this is a Consumer Product Safety Commission document. Now, the idea for this particular set of data is that we have a toy company that has data about interactions that they've had with customers. And they're concerned, they need information about product safety because they started getting concerned calls from people whose toys, like hoverboards, were catching on fire or having other problems. And when you're consolidating ERP or CRM data, it's important that you're able to anticipate problems as quickly as you can to either save your brand or save your customers or avoid a recall, which may be more costly than whatever the margin is that you're pulling back. So I'm going to do another harmonized step here. Again, I'm just clicking a button that runs a piece of code, like the code that we saw earlier. And when I come back to access the data, what I've now done is I've gone in and noticed any city information in the record about where the person was from. And I've translated that into latitude and longitude points that show up in the interface. So extending MarkLogic's Java API, we can go in, or REST API, we can go in and take the contents of this and have them show up in ways that are compelling for our users. So if I decide to zoom in, maybe click here. Oops, a little too far. There we go. I can choose to say, just show me Chicago with the facets. And I can also, instead of that, I can say, you know what, limit it to the visible space. So only show me the stuff that's in the viewport of this particular rectangle. And once I'm in there, I can combine that constraint. Oops, sorry about that, guys. There we go. Let's zoom in again. Different place. Here we go. And if we have Louisiana here, zoom out a little bit more so we can get a couple states. There's California. Let's say we only want Los Angeles. Now we only see Los Angeles. And from that, we can also say, show me people with the last name of Bauman. So we're not just using the text search, it's combining with the facets just like you'd expect from Amazon, for instance, right? The user experience that you'd expect with lightning fast search results. But we want to go a little bit past just looking at this data. So let's go ahead and bring in some event data. This is going to be call center information with transcripts, with notes that go into detail about what the circumstances were of something, like a fire, for instance. And when we come back here, we're going to see another data set. It's already loaded. It's already indexed. It's already fully searchable. And these are events. So we have a warranty issue. We have a product request, device issue. So if I click on the details, we'll see that this lives in the same database with these other documents. And if we want to, for instance, we can go and take this, device will not go in reverse. Go back to search, type that in. No, bad example. I think there's like 898. There we go. So this particular one has not just the request, but it also has a customer record that's bound to that. Here, policy ID 898. So that call can be connected. I'm going to do two more enrichments. One's going to be to do some harmonization, and then I'm actually going to load some triples also for semantic linkages. We'll come back to the search. I think there are some documents at the end here, if I remember. Yeah, 982, that might be one. Want to know when. Let's just type in fire. Device defect. Customer stated that his device overheated and started a fire. That's not good. However, we need the person. Let me try that again. And here we have a graph that we can follow to look at the relationships that this person has in the rest of the data in the data set. So this person has a lender, has mortgage, and is related to ABC Manufacturing, who is also related to these other people. So we saw that Richard Daniels had this problem with ABC Manufacturing. Maybe we should take a look at Jacqueline, I'm not going to spell that right, Jacqueline Gibson. Okay. Here's this person. Hoverboard started a fire in her living room. We can choose to look up ABC Manufacturing to learn more about them and see where they're coming up. And you'll notice that little knowledge of the data, little modeling is required, and we're already searching through notes data. We're searching through the data we didn't have time to model. It's all contributing, while faceted information over here is coming from the headers that are at the top of the document. Any questions so far? Or any part that you'd like me to focus more on? Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
So what you are showing, is this basically an example of using it, or is this the concept?
This is an example of using it, quickly prototyping for the purpose of a call center. Yeah.
And you had, buttons to like generate, harmonize.
Uh-huh.
But did you show the code behind it?
Yeah, well, we spent a little bit of I can come back to that. I'm happy to. We actually built in a little bit of extra time because the demo is pretty straightforward, so I'm happy to do that. Maybe I can, let me see a show of hands for other people that want me to go back to the code right now. Good. Perfect. That's great. The code. Yeah.
My question really is, what role does the data hub framework play here? Because I think you're building an application, you have some buttons, so there's exploring, you wrote the exploring behind.
Uh-huh.
So what does data hub framework provide you?
Uh,
Is it just a model, or?
Yeah, so if you think about, oh, right. Thanks.
Well, done.
I'm supposed to throw this thing. I was a little caught up. So the question was, what does the Data Hub framework offer you? Okay, it offers you a quick mechanism to be able to stand up with most of this work already done, so that you can drop your own X-query code into an application that will give you the ability to search.
So this the interface that you see is from the Data Hub framework?
Yeah, so
okay.
what you see is the concepts of the 4 things on the side are all readily available for you. And the Data Hub framework product page covers in detail like a release overview, how to use it, how to install it. And then there's the workshop tomorrow. Back to the code. So I showed code examples, but I didn't focus much on the code itself that was driving that button. So what I'll do for that, why don't I do this for you actually? I'm going to take the code in the document and I'm going to put it into the editor so it shows color coding. So if you'd like to, I can walk through what's happening, or you can take a look at it. I'm not sure about your familiarity. Did you want me to walk through what it's doing, or did you just want to take a look? Very quickly? Okay. So the first thing we're doing is when we're executing the code, we're saying we want to target a certain set of documents. Those documents already exist in this case. They don't need to. The documents can be executed as part of the documents can be created as part of the task. Most likely when you do harmonization, you're focused on existing documents and you're doing something to enrich them so that they'll pull either a standardized version of what they themselves already are, or something from the web or from a SQL connection or some other kind of data set. So what we're looking at is line 22, we're saying, determine who I am and save that as a variable. I'm admin. We're going to see that show up on line 33, last updated by user variable. It's going to pump that right in there. Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. There's a lot of white space. Thanks, Dave. And then we're also going to capture a variable that's going to say, take that user and add entities to it, and we're going to use that later for like a collection for organization. And then we're also going to go and do an argument to say, if this document that we're targeting ends with XML, we're going to consider that extension to describe what it is. And we're going to run a routine that's going to take the end variable and create an XML document. The alternative is going to be an else that says, if it's not XML, then we know it's JSON. MarkLogic stores XML and JSON as its first-class structured formats, along with triples. So if not, make an object node, which is going to be manifested in MarkLogic as a JSON document, so it's just like what it was in the first place. And then at the end of all that, return the MarkLogic function on 64, which is document insert. Document insert is going to take what's the document name, what's the content of the document, what are the collections, and what are the permissions. Permissions and collections is the correct order here. Does that cover what you were wondering about? Does it also cover the questions other people had with their hands raised? Can I throw this to you? No. Yes. Okay, because I can, okay. I'm going to give it a try. Yes.
There's supposed to be some, or I imagine there's some type of template of code that is probably generated for you, and then the developer would have to go through and add in this information? Yes, no? Or is this all just voodoo
Well,
and
this
come
code
together?
is purpose-built for the demonstrated content. So we're marking this up with an awareness of something about the source data. This code wouldn't necessarily work for any tables that you load into the system.
But, okay, maybe I'm not asking it right. Then you would have to go in, obviously, with your own code to add in after ingesting to be able to harmonize.
Yeah.
That's
The harmonization is executed with the Data Hub framework. It comes with, I think, some examples. But you'd be using boilerplates or making your own code to run these kind of commands.
right.
And MarkLogic is thoroughly documented.
Excellent.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Well, I'm here. There you go.
Where do we define the reductions?
Well, the redaction is happening at the time that is happening in the code that's loading the document. So we're executing a task that's saying, what I'm showing the code for is a task that's saying this document exists, and we're going to add something to the top of it. There's another snippet of code that's called on when the content is actually loaded, which is a step we kind of breeze through. So I'm not sure which snippet it is, but
That's fine.
the idea is that this particular snippet of code is done after that task has already happened to the source content as it comes into the system.
Okay. Is it something like another form of CPF, or
CPF is a place where code like this can exist, but it doesn't need to be. In this case, it's MarkLogic content pump is just calling on a transform module. So this code would be a transform module.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody want to test how far I can throw it? Oh, I don't know about that. There's somebody in front of you that's not looking. Here you go.
My question is like, how much of this coding is created by the developer and as a end client, and how much of effort do you think for someone to learn and reach this kind of proficiency level?
So I think the question is, what's the learning curve?
Learning curve. Yes.
Okay. I don't know if I can adequately answer that. Yeah, that's great. I was going to point you to MarkLogic University, who's got a booth out there. Yeah.
No, in a general level, I'm saying. Yeah.
Do you have any programming experience?
Oh, yeah.
Lots?
Lots. Yeah.
Okay, then, yeah, you take the fundamental Monday class, and then you take the 4-day free developer one course, and you're going to finish it.
I've been looking at Dave, yeah.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
Jump on that a little bit. One of the purposes of the Data Hub framework, by the way, I'm Dave Castle. I run the technical community program at MarkLogic. Paxton Hare, who works for me, built the Data Hub framework. Part of the goal of the framework is to reduce the learning curve between somebody who's new to MarkLogic and being able to build something significant in a productive way. Right, so the idea is by going through the framework, you're going to be steered into exactly what you need to know. You're going to be focused on doing very specific things. What that's going to result in, the framework itself focuses on the harmonization stage. Right, so you can bring data in, you're going to harmonize it, get it into a good spot. The next step after that is building a nice, pretty UI on top of it. And that's not something the Data Hub framework gives you out of the box. The UI that we just looked at was built on top of data that was produced by the Data Hub framework. So just to clarify that point, does that help?
thank you. So in the same aspect, so in the example that he's showing, right, is he using MLCP transform function, or is he truly using the Data Hub harmonization framework?
Well, the steps that we explicitly went through for manipulating the content here is using the Data Hub framework. It's executing the code based on that.
I was always under the impression that Data Hub framework, you have a staging database, and then the transform database moves into a different database. Is that the wrong impression I have? Or?
This particular implementation doesn't work exactly that way. This is just an example of an application. The scope of the presentation was just to show an application that was directly built quickly with the Data Hub framework, but we didn't focus on staging for this particular exercise.
But the skeleton that it generates when we run the Data Hub framework, it takes into account all those things.
Yes, definitely. You can toss it to me. Thanks. Okay, about 10 minutes. And then when we go beyond that, part of the proposition is, to Dave's point about being able to put interfaces on top of it, it's very easy for us to connect with high charts or D3 JavaScript libraries and take the things that were facets, which are aggregates of data, and say, I'm going to take up 13% of a pie as a pie piece and create visualizations off of that same data. So if you have to make dashboards, this is an accelerator for that too. Any more questions about the demonstration? Yeah.
Can you maybe just recap at a high level, what were the steps you did to build this? So you brought data in.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so we, thank you. Before we leave the demo, it's important to do a recap. So what we did was we ingested the data as is. We were able to prove that we could instantly access the data and start to look at it to understand what we have. I could type in atoms and bring up 2 records that had 2 different structures. Then we went over to the Harmonize button, and of course this follows the buttons we see there on the side of the application. Go to Harmonize and use the buttons to do a few things. First, we created the envelope, which says take the document that's there and put a parent element around it, the envelope. The second one, and maybe it's the time to jump there. The second one says now that the envelope is there, in the second one, let's take pieces of the source record and make them in a consistent fashion in the header. That was the second step. After that, we broke and talked about the code and how you can do it with things that were out of the scope of Data Hub for the sake of covering the concepts. Then we came back and we looked at, let's look at the state and the city, and let's use geospatial awareness to build a latitude and longitude and have a range index off of that so that we can drive some of the visualizations in the geospatial part of the app. Then after that, we created a connection between the customer data, which is the record of the people, with the records of the events that we loaded. And then after that, we put linkages together using triples so that we could draw connections in the graph that we saw, so that we could click on a person, open up the graph section, click on an association, see the relationship, and understand more about what they're related with, so we could go back to the search and type in ABC manufacturing, maybe put fire in there. And now we have a better idea of what we're looking for, because when we started, maybe we're not even involved in that company. Maybe we just bought that company. We don't even know what we're looking at. All that we know is that we heard that the liability, the risk, came from the fact that they were selling toys that maybe had electrical failures. Or they had allergens in their stuffed animals. You know, anything. And then at the end, we talked about operationalizing and the ability to take this data and turn it into something that a user who doesn't have to know much or any of this stuff can still get what they need. So the takeaways we have today, we talked about the life cycle, the MarkLogic approach to data integration, and how it differs from and surpasses some of the methods that you might have to consider. It's important to know that MarkLogic, as Ken mentioned today, with our support of Microsoft Azure, MarkLogic works on the cloud and it works on-prem. If you have an operating system, any popular flavor of Linux or Windows or Mac, you're going to be able to install the software and use it instantly in that environment. The Data Hub concept of being able to bring in data that's critical, knowing that it's going to be captured transactionally of all different shapes and sizes, and drive your existing applications or the applications you didn't have time to build. That's what the Data Hub allows you to do. We talked a little bit about MarkLogic University and the options that you have with training. We can certainly talk more about a project that you have. I'm going to be here all day tomorrow. And the site, of course, is available for you to go deeper on your own after MarkLogic World is over. Any questions? Yeah. No. Thank you. We just got a question about whether the code for this is publicly available on GitHub. Not at the time. No. But the Data Hub framework is. Yeah. Sorry, I sped through that at the beginning. Thank you. Yeah.
That dashboard that showed the geospatial results and results from the extract,
Yeah.
is that like actually out of the box?
In the Data Hub framework, I mean, MarkLogic has the can broadcast geospatial aggregates directly out of the box itself. And then do you have an answer for that, Dave? I didn't repeat it again. We got a question about geospatial capabilities and whether what we saw with the map, to what extent what we saw with the map is available out of the box.
Okay, so that's actually, it's a geospatial facet. So there are functions within MarkLogic. I'm sure you've seen other facets. And so the way the data comes back is very, very similar to that. I'm trying to think if we have a publicly available example of turning that into the kind of display we saw there. We used to with that builder.
Yeah.
That's not around anymore. if you want to get a hold of me later, I can try to find an example to make that visible.
What about ingest data as is? I'm thinking the left panel, is that all part of the box?
Is
The left panel where we saw the concepts broken down with the ingest as is, access the data.
Yeah, so the Data Hub framework, I'm trying to remember. There's a quick start part of it that does provide some easy ways to get data in, but the framework itself is kind of agnostic about how data lands in the database. The key part of it is really a harmonization step and making sure that those flows are implemented using best practices.
Located on GitHub, and is there a minimum version?
MarkLogic 8, in fact, the Data Hub framework is being used in production in a couple of settings with MarkLogic 8. Data Hub framework is in alpha stage for MarkLogic 9, but we're anticipating that that'll get to a proper release soon.
So my question is about geospatial data in collection. So when which step do we put all the, let's say I need Midwest data, like claims only from Midwest, and can I put that data in a collection upfront when I'm doing the step number 2, or do I to do it in step number 3? And is it possible to do that, geospatial into a collection, so I can do do a better search capabilities on it?
Do you want to take that?
With your revisions, please, after. So the idea, if I understand correctly, is you're trying to introduce geospatial information and possibly have it defined at some level at a collection or some other conceptual level, right? Sure. So you can certainly capture data that's inherent to the record when the record is being loaded into MarkLogic with the framework. You can also choose to extend and get that data at any point when it's being loaded or as it's being harmonized. Well, you can do it when you load the data, but the concept that we're covering here really focuses on a flow where that's happening in the harmonization.
Oh, I see, harmonization, okay.
I mean, that's the way I think about it, but it's
So just a quick thought. For geospatial data, yes, kind of which box would it fall into? So I'd say we're going to ingest as is, which means your data may have some geospatial component. Whatever it has, we'll bring it in. We'll bring it in. Thank you. In that form in box 1. In box 2, we might do some poking around with it. If it already happens to be lat long, then great. We can already do geospatial searches. We might do some indexes on that to help us out. In box 3, if our source data has something like Chicago, Illinois, well, we can search on that by name, but not by a map, right? So in the harmonized step, we might say, now it's important, in this third time through the cycle, let's say, now it's important to do some geo lookups and start assigning lat longs. So we might do things with it at different times, including we might not do anything with it for a couple months because maybe that's not an important requirement up front. Does that make sense?
We have one more question back here. And then
What if
Thanks,
the data in step 1 is dynamic? In other words, I've still got an app that's producing that data. Can I do a refresh on this process, or do I have to redo it?
That kind of gets back to, I think of that as being more of a MarkLogic question. Dave, do you agree? About the question was about if the data is coming in and there has to be a awareness of change. Is that correct? Like change data capture. How would we implement that? I think the thing that occurs to me is that if there is a key available inside of the record that makes it unique, those records can be evaluated at the time of load to make sure that they're overriding.
No, the question was really, what if there's more data later? In other words, I'm still producing records from the process that I'm now ingesting in step 1.
Yeah, you can absolutely continue to ingest. Yep.
Okay, I think
Thank
with that,
you.
let's wrap it up. Thank you.